everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Do Good to Lead Well podcast series. I'm your host, Craig Dowden, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with us today. I'm really excited to dig into another important and engaging conversation. And before we do, just want to provide a little bit of history in terms of where Do Good to Lead Well came about. It was as a consequence of the release of my first book, Do Good to Lead Well, The Science and Practice of Positive Leadership. And at that time, had the profound privilege of speaking with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, TED speakers. And what I wanted to do was open it up to a wider community, a wider conversation, so everybody could participate. And then at the beginning of the pandemic, really opened it up, and it's amazing to think that that's 4 years ago, and started speaking with CEOs and top CEOs from leading organizations and having this really rich dialogue around how do we lead and what's important to do and how do we adjust to the changes that are upon us. And if anything, the speed of change has increased over time with tremendous developments and technological advancements. And I want to extend a sincere expression of gratitude because of your ongoing support, because of the feedback you provide, the recommendations, the social shares. Do Good to Lead Well is now ranked in the top 0.5% of podcasts in the world, which is extraordinary. I feel so privileged to be a part of that, and that cannot happen without you. And a primary reason is that I get the privilege of speaking with amazing guests, and I'm really excited today because we're going to dig into a lot of really important topics. And my guest is Dr. Lisa Calder, who is the CEO of the Canadian Medical Protective Association, an organization which represents over 111,000 physician members. Dr. Calder joined the CMPA in 2015 as the Director of Medical Care Analytics. In addition to her 5-year residency at the University of Ottawa, she completed an emergency medicine research fellowship and obtained her Master of Science degree in epidemiology in 2007. As a researcher, she has published close to 90 peer-reviewed publications, and as everybody knows, I'm a huge fan of evidence-based practice and insight, and has been successful in securing research funding, including over $2 million as a principal investigator. Dr. Calder is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Department of Emergency Medicine. She has received the University of Ottawa's Excellence in Emergency Medicine Quality and Safety Award, as well as the Canadian Association of Emergency Physicians Teacher of the Year Award. And I could keep going. Lisa, such an absolute pleasure to welcome you to the program this morning.
Thanks, Craig. I'm really excited to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, and where I'd love to start is a conversation about leadership, which is everywhere these days. And I'd love to get your take in terms of what do you feel are the key qualities that people need to be successful in leadership roles, both today and as we move into the future?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, Craig, because as you said, there's a lot of models of leadership out there. And I've taken courses and had assessments and reflected on my own leadership style, and so I come from my own perspective and what I've seen and what I think works. But I will say that to your earlier point, the pace of change is really high. And I think when we look at what we need in leadership now, and it's very linked to what you just put up for your slide, is we need empathy. We need the ability to understand and acquire rapidly changing information and data and synthesize it and understand it. We need, I would say, more generalist skills. I think that's a real emerging need in terms of the future of leadership, is that we used to really focus leadership on expertise or experience, but increasingly I think it's actually more about being able to build those relationships, create phenomenal teams, optimize teams, and not be the expert, actually bring the experts together to do the best work. Because many fields are moving so quickly. We're in a knowledge-based organization. The work that I do, I can't keep on top of all of the evidence that is coming out. And so I need a team of experts. So my job is actually bringing together the experts, optimizing the experts, not being the expert. So I think, for me, it's empathy. It's being able to keep on top of what's happening, but using your network and resources to do so. And it's really about leveraging talent and teams. That to me are the three key things that I think we need to think about in leadership now and into the future.
Well, what a great, and again, this is exactly why I was excited. This is so much to dive into right away. And one of the things, because it's interesting in my coaching work, I can hear this, or in personal conversations I have, it's almost like, as you say, you can't keep on top of everything that's happening. Yet for some people, it's this almost like internal struggle and dare I say ego around that. So how have you been able to almost unpacking that where you go, all right, I'm all right with that, and shifting that perspective? It's so powerful, yet it can be challenging and intimidating for people to let that go.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind for me, Craig. The first is, you know, um, based on my training as an emergency physician, actually, I was trained as a generalist. Like when you're an emerge doc, you have to be ready for whatever comes in. I cannot be the expert in cardiology and neurology and orthopedic surgery, but I need to be able to recognize when you need to see those experts, right? So that's a very transferable skill to me in terms of leadership. You mentioned ego, though, and I do think there's an important piece of us asking ourselves, why am I here? Like, what am
Mm,
I actually trying to achieve? And from my perspective, in the role that I am now, I am very much focused on the mission of the organization. It's not about me, it's not about my legacy. And you mentioned coaching. I've done coaching to work on that, right? To really ask myself the question, why am I here? What do I actually want to do? What's important to me? And part of that's recognizing that I'm replaceable. Like it doesn't have to be me. Anyone, there's a whole bunch of other people who could do this role. I have something to offer right now that I think is of benefit, but I need to think about the fact that it's not just me, and I don't want the organization relying just on one person. I want to create the situation where we have multiple amazing leaders who can step in and do what needs to be done. And you do have to put your ego aside for that. And you do have to recognize that, um, you know, the other part that I've done a lot of work on, especially for physicians, our identity is tied to our work so intrinsically. It's like if like I am an emergency physician, if I'm not that, who am I type of thing. And I did a lot of work with my coach to unpack that and say, actually, no, it's a job and you are more than that. And who are you as a person?
yeah.
And that's so important because if you're grounded in this is who I am and I love this work and this is what I'm doing now, and that might change and that's okay.
Mhm.
And not being tied to this is my identity, and if I don't do the best, the world will fall apart. It's really interesting work, and so I've done that work with my coaches and with a psychologist actually to really think about what's my purpose, why am I here, what's important to me. And then knowing that really helps you put the ego aside and recognize, here's what I have, here's what I can contribute. And it's not about me knowing everything. It's about me also being committed to position the organization for success. So if something happens to me, then someone else can step in.
Well, and I love that, and it reminds me of a great quote from Peter Drucker as well. It's about nobody can be expert at everything, and I love your point because it's so powerful in right at the beginning, Lisa, where you talked about well that generalist mentality and how you just framed it, and I want to revisit that because it's so insightful around it's having the insight to know when to dig deeper and which expert to access in which situation. So incredibly powerful because we can be in our lanes and almost like that's all we see. And so being able to almost like the conductor and orchestrate, so great. Um, I've got a question already from Debbie saying, I love your focus on purpose and why am I here? Sometimes I struggle with how to answer that question or if I'm answering it right. Any tips from your journey of answering that question yourself?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And I have to say that um, this has taken work. It's not like I've always known, right? It's taken work, and and I think the other thing that I learned was, when I was practicing emergency medicine, which I practiced as an emerge doc for 15 years, um, I didn't initially engage in a lot of reflection. I had young kids, and you sort of feel like I don't have time. But I actually did a leadership fellowship, and one of the things I learned in the leadership fellowship was the power of reflection. And the other thing I learned is that you can't assume that it's just going to happen. Like, I'll do some journaling on the weekend type of thing. For me, anyways, I had to schedule it in, and that's where the power of coaching was very helpful for me. So I hired a coach early in my career, and meeting with my coach regularly provoked the reflection. And
Mm,
my coach was really good at asking me the questions that I needed to reflect on to think about what is my purpose. And there's in quality improvement, there's the rule of the 5 whys. It applies to this as well. So you might be like, what's my purpose? Okay, I'll write something down. Really, what's your purpose? Why is that your purpose? And
mm,
why? And why and why and why? And digging and digging and digging, and then reflecting and thinking about that, revisiting it, thinking, does this still make sense? The other thing I remember doing, I did some group coaching as well with some other female leaders, and we did some actually a really powerful exercise, which helped us do some mind mapping on
mm,
what are the elements in your life that are the most important to you, and drawing those out visually. I still have it, like this Bristol board, and it's all different colors and that kind of thing. But that helped me really hone in on my purpose
mm,
and understand that these are the things that bring me joy. These are the things that bring me meaning. When I say I want to have impact, that's what it means to me.
mm,
And one of my, when I was a researcher, the chair of our department, Ian Steele, who's an internationally renowned researcher, whenever we do my annual reviews, he'd say, and I do my whole report, I've done this and this and this and this, and I've published these papers and presented here and got these grants. And he'd sit back and he'd go, that's great, Lisa. How are you having impact? And my first response would be like, didn't I just tell you that?
yeah.
But he would always push me. How are you having impact? Impact, impact, impact. And so when you get those questions, and again, there's to me a piece around the repetition and thinking about that same question over and over again. And for me, it helps to write down and journal. It helps to do things visually. It helps to talk to other people. That's helped me really hone in on what is my purpose? Why am I here? What is meaningful to me? What
Mm,
brings me joy? What makes me feel like I'm making a difference? And once you have that, it's very powerful in helping you make choices.
mm. Well, and I've already got a bunch of comments going, awesome, thank you, super helpful. Another one, I am taking the 5 whys exercise. That's fantastic. So thank you, Lisa, and have a follow. That's why this is so fun. And someone said, I really appreciate about the mind mapping and seeing what's important. Sometimes I feel in tension between what's important and where I spend my time.
Mm-hmm.
How do I reconcile that or change that? That's a big question. That's great. I love it.
That is a huge question. It's an important one, and one I spent time thinking about as well. I used to, I used to in my office have a pie chart where I would say I want to spend this much time doing clinical work, this much time doing research, this much time doing teaching. And then we used to joke amongst the emergency researcher group, we'd say, this pie chart works if we have more than 24 hours in a day, right? So I'm doing 40% here, 40% here, 40% here, and 40% here. And you go, wait, that doesn't
Yeah,
end up.
the math. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
So but I think it's actually really revealing. And one of the things that I do now that I find super helpful, and again, my current coach, Deborah Hughes, encourages me always to ask myself, where are you spending your time, and is it where you should be spending your time? And so one of the things, and this is going to sound maybe a little obsessive, but I've done this for a long time and I find it very helpful. In my calendar, I have a color coding system.
mm,
And so it helps me on a number of ways, but at a glance, I can say, oh, these are the board meetings I have this week. These are the one-on-one meetings I have. These are the external stakeholder meetings I have, etc. But my assistant, who is amazing, shout out to Monique LaFrance. I cannot live without her. She's fantastic. She every year will do an analysis for me based on that color coding system and say, this is the percentage of time you spent with the board. This is the percentage of time you spent with your team. This is how much time you spent externally. And that data for me in a snapshot is super helpful for me to ask my question, is this aligned with my intention? Do I want to spend as much time focusing externally? Am I spending enough time internally? Am I spending enough time with the right layers within the organization? And so then not only looking at that myself, discussing it with my coach, discussing it with my team and saying, here's my data set, and even sharing it with my board and saying, this is how much time I'm spending. Does that make sense? Do we think this is appropriate? And I've had some great conversations with other CEOs and saying, this is how much time I'm spending do this. Like, what do you do? And so it's really, I find that really helpful to get a sense of, am I spending the best time on the right things? I just read a book, a blank on the author, but it was on it was Deborah Hughes recommended to me. I'm going to get the number wrong, but it's like X number of hours. I think it was 4,000 hours,
Yes.
4,000 days. Anyways.
Yep.
The book was talking about time management. But one of the things that really resonated with me in terms of time management is it's all an illusion that we can manage our time, right? And we tend to sort of put all these, parameters around it in terms of like increasing productivity, increasing time. So at the end of the day, as much as I do those exercises and I reflect on it, one of my gratitude practices at the end of the day was, what did I do today I was really proud of? What did I do to take care of myself? What did I do that was good for someone else? And when I do that, I know that, okay, if I can answer those 3 questions at the end of the day, I have spent my time well. So there's the sort of longitudinal view, but there's also the day-to-day view, and really thinking about, did I do things that felt good today, right? Because sometimes you have days where you're like, I don't know, was there anything? And so it's good to take that moment and be like, yes, actually, you know what? I went for a walk today, midday. That was awesome, right? So things like that I think are important to reflect upon when you're asking yourself, am I spending the right time in the right places? And then the last comment I'll just make, because there's so much to say on this topic, but my husband is a partner at a law firm. And one of the things he started saying to me very early in my career, when I was, again, had that pie chart and I'm trying to do, my clinical work, my research and my teaching, and there's admin, is he goes, think about your hourly rate and the things that you're doing, and does it make sense for that rate?
Right.
And that question kept nagging me in the back of my head, because sometimes I would find myself doing things saying, does this make sense? And sometimes the answer is no, it doesn't. And that's, I think, really key as a leader, is figuring out the things you can delegate, the things that you maybe don't need to spend as much time on, because it doesn't make sense for you to spend your skills and expertise on that task.
Well, and thank you. And again, so many wonderful follow-up comments on this and great insight. And I think, one of the things that's really resonating, Lisa, with your answer is around, and when I speak to very successful people, executives, they will talk, there's an intentionality behind it. And so it's so we can easily get caught up in the pace and the hectic nature of our schedules and everything else. And then to your point, taking that time for reflection, taking that time to pause and go, am I investing my time? How am I investing my time in the areas that matter to me most? I think it's just fantastic. And we're going to continue along the the wave of follow-up questions. This is what's so much fun. Stacy was saying, I was really intrigued that you journal. I'm finding it difficult to adopt it as a practice. What are the benefits that you've seen, or any tips around how I can overcome this hurdle?
Oh, that's a great question, Stacy. And listen, I know people who journal daily, and I have great admiration for that. That's not me. I will admit it. I am an intermittent journaler, but and I tried bullet journaling as well. So when you have like a journal with a few prompts that you try and do every day, for me, the journaling really helps when I'm stuck. The journaling also helps when, again, I'm working with my coach, and she'll be like, answer these questions before we meet next, type of thing, that I find really helpful. So there has to be some structure around it for me. And again, I think that sometimes I'll do it myself, but mostly it's helpful when it's tied to either a thorny problem I'm trying to work through, or I recognize like something's got to shift, something's not quite right. I will then, and I've also said to my coach on occasion, I feel like I need some questions to help me work through this. And she'll send me, here's some questions you can journal on. which is awesome. And so I need the prompts. I need the questions to help get me going and flowing rather than the free, just whatever's top of mind. I find that personally very helpful. And there's journals that have the prompts out there that you can get, which is great. But I find having the resource of my coach to suggest some questions for me to work through some pieces is super helpful.
Mm. Well, and again, so many comments coming in about thank you. This is great, very helpful. And once again, what I'm really taking away from it, and I think it's so valuable because we can get stuck in looking at a particular methodology, if you will, and as you shared, which is so important, and you see this in so many different domains, the gratitude that you talked about, the gratitude journal or exercise, they'll say, it's less about following this concrete structures. So what works? So I love intermittent journaler. That's great. Whatever it is, it's the activity itself that drives so much. I've got another question coming in, so way to go. Ted said or asked, love that you highlighted we need more empathy. Any tips around how we can demonstrate empathy more effectively as leaders, and any thoughts on how come it seems like empathy is going down?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting observation, Ted. I've been very fortunate over my career to witness amazing empathy amongst leaders, and not just leaders, amongst people I work with. So starting in the emergency department, I think that it's very easy in the midst of what we used to call controlled chaos. You have a lot of people who are in distress. A lot of people are having their worst day. And sometimes you can feel powerless because you can't help someone. There are people we can help, there's people you can't. And sometimes the best thing you can do is be empathetic and to take a moment. And I really tried hard. And I had some amazing mentors who I modeled off, other emerge docs who I watched them make connections with people, because that's the challenge in emergency medicine, right? You have a very short time to make a connection with someone, to build trust with them in their worst day often. And so really thinking about body language, thinking about how you're connecting with that person, how you're showing that you're listening. For me, empathy is a lot of people, first of all, recognizing someone as a human. And that sounds really basic, but it's stunning to me. Like even like you go to the grocery store and the number of people who are checking out and they think they're in a self-checkout because they're not even like, they don't make eye contact with the person. They don't say, hey, how are you? Like nothing. And that drives me nuts. Like these are human beings, right? Like what are we losing here? So, and I talk to my girls, my kids about that all the time, which is those are important interactions. That's a human being there. And so it's the same thing about, for me, it's really, knowing how to have someone feel heard. And this is something that, and also I think, we talk about authenticity a lot, and some people say it's an overused term.
Yep.
But people can pick up very quickly when you're fronting and you're not being genuine. And so part of it's being sort of present, part of it's being able to tolerate when there's emotion. That's the other thing that I think is really key. And that's one thing that as an emerge doc, we were trained pretty much to suppress emotions because you really didn't have time to do a lot of processing. But sometimes actually showing that you're feeling impacted by what someone's going through is really what empathy is all about. So I use that now as a CEO, and I have situations where either someone's having a bad day or we're talking about a difficult issue and you can see it's provoking an emotion. And one of the things that I often do is I learned this from, I think it's Brene Brown, who says, name it, right? Yeah. Name it and identify it. And so for me, it's, I can see that this is affecting you, or I can see that this is creating a lot of feelings and this is okay. It's giving permission to have the feeling, it's recognizing it, it's naming it, and basically saying, I can see this is making you feel really sad, or I can see this is really hard. Because you're just basically saying, I see you, I hear you, I'm there for you, right? And I think the key thing is sometimes people are worried about being vulnerable in those moments. And I've had a lot of conversations with people. And again, shout out to Brene Brown, because I'm a big fan of hers and her resources and the power of vulnerability. I'm a big believer in that. People sometimes basically put an equivalent between vulnerability and weakness, and have this perception that as a leader, you have to be strong. There is power in vulnerability, because in vulnerability, there's connection, and in vulnerability, there is empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, as leaders, we're looked to as like, you have to have all the solutions, and you don't always have all the solutions. And sometimes the best thing you can do is be like, this is hard, and I
Right.
get it, and I understand. And that, I think, is very, very powerful. I think too, then, that it helps build trust in you as a leader, because and that's the other thing I feel very, very strongly, is that as a leader, it's okay to say, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. This is hard. I don't know. Let's try and find out. Let's try and solve this together.
Mm-hmm.
So we just did our employee engagement survey at the CMPA, and one of our last questions was, do you have a message for the CEO? And we have 550 employees, and there were 250 comments, and I've just gone through all the 250 comments. But one of the things that really made me feel good was when people said, Lisa makes me feel heard and seen. That's to me so important. And that to me is about empathy, right? So that's what I love about that is it's my intention, it's what I'm trying to do, and you don't always know if it's landing, right? You're like, okay, that's what I'm aiming to do. But when you get the feedback and people say, I am feeling seen and heard, I'm like, that's fantastic, because that's exactly what I'm trying to do.
Right. No, well, and that's awesome. And to have that level of number of people providing comments is extraordinary. So that's, speaks volumes about the culture that you've created. And I love, Lisa, what you're talking about in terms of being present, the simple things like other people are human beings. There are other people in our surroundings. Be aware of them, acknowledge them, sit with them. And that point around labeling is so powerful, that labeling our emotions, because even though we experience, feel emotion, how many of us have taken the time to, as you say, name it? And there's so much fantastic research that shows that the better we are at labeling how we're feeling, the more specific we are, the quicker we process it, the more we learn from it, the more that we can take proactive and constructive steps, like all kinds of fantastic insight. And so thank you. And I've got several comments. One, this is a master class in emotional intelligence. Thank you. I'm loving this. And it's
Great. Can I just
funny.
pick up on what you just said?
Yeah.
One of the meditation practices that I do that has really helped me in terms of the naming, because I can tell you when I started meditating, which was 10 years ago, I remember and I do guided meditations, and one of the meditations was like, what are you feeling? And check in and how are you feeling before you start? And it was, how are you feeling physically? How are you feeling emotionally? How are you feeling mentally? And at the beginning, I'll tell you, my most common response was fine, 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 fine. And that was because I didn't have that ability to name it. And then I started, and the app is very brilliant because it will give you options. And then you start realizing I'm only picking one or two things. What about these other options? And
Yeah.
then as you start to train yourself to do that and name it more, then you really start to know yourself and recognize the nuance in emotion. And I think that is very powerful, as you say.
Well, and thank you. And thank you for sharing the story, because, and again, this is why I was so excited for us to chat, because that's such a powerful insight you just shared, Lisa, around when you started. And when we start, it's kind of, I'm fine, how are you? I'm fine, I'm busy. It's just, and these are just reflexive responses. And yet it's almost like having a black and white painting versus like all the different color spectrum. And then it adds so much insight into who we are, and it just adds that depth and everything else. And that takes time to develop that vocabulary, and recognizing that, oh yeah, well, who knows me better than me? I'm experiencing this stuff. Yet to take that time, I love that, as you say, the guided meditation practice. This is a beautiful segue, because I know one of the areas that you're really passionate about is wellness and CEO wellness and executive and leadership wellness. So what inspired you to look at this more closely? And I'm going to ask a couple of follow-up questions. What are some of the things that you do for yourself? And I think you've started to talk about some of those, as well as how do you bring that level of focus to the senior leadership and the CMPA more broadly? I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, well, you'll have to bear with me for a few minutes, Craig, because I do have a bit of a story on this, which is I came to my own wellness as a priority through my own wellness challenges. So 8 years ago, I went on a beautiful vacation with my husband to St. Lucia, and we had a lovely time. And I got a whole bunch of mosquito bites, didn't think much about it. And then I came home, and a week later, I got a fever. But it wasn't just a regular fever. The fever was still there after 2 days, after 3 days. And I was like, okay, now this is a bit strange. So I went and saw my family doctor, and he's like, yeah, let's order some tests. Well, I had a fever for 10 days. And then my lymph nodes started really getting enlarged. And so then we're like, okay, something unusual is happening. So I went to see infectious disease specialists, and they did a whole bunch of testing. And their final conclusion was, you have a tropical illness that you picked up from a mosquito, but we don't know what it is. And like they sent my blood to like the Winnipeg lab and a whole bunch of things. They're like, and so basically the term we use that in medicine, we say not yet diagnosed. So basically you have a tropical mosquito-borne illness, not yet diagnosed. So I go, great, now what? And they go, well, we don't know. And I'm like, okay, so when am I going to be better? Because at this point I started heading into some serious fatigue. And they said, we don't know. And I said, okay, so but for patients in this situation, what do you typically see? And they said, we don't see a lot of this. So I'm like, and so for like a high performing person, I'm like, this is not okay for me. Like, I need the plan. I need to know. I'm a busy person, right? Like, I can't be, but essentially I was forced by my body to take a 3-month break because I had severe fatigue. I couldn't get out of bed for 3 months.
Wow.
I couldn't even, at the beginning, I couldn't do email. I couldn't read even because of the energy that was required. Even listening to the radio was exhausting. So that was a huge lesson to me because I was facing a lot of uncertainty because no one could tell me if and when I was going to get better. I also learned a lot about my energy and what would take my energy. And I remember speaking to a physician who specialized in physician wellness, and she said to me early in my illness, she goes, you have to stop doing email. I said, what are you talking about? And she said, email is emotionally exhausting. You have to stop. And I didn't understand what she was talking about until I stopped and then went, oh, yes, I see now. So that whole experience. And then after that, I had cyclical fatigue episodes that went on for 7 years. And so, and I saw multiple specialists. And so, but one of the things that I started doing was I started working with a wellness coach. I started working with a psychologist in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy. I started really reflecting and thinking about, okay, so my energy now is a precious resource that I don't have unlimited amounts of. And given that, I need to understand what takes my energy and what gives me my energy back. And so that was a lot of work and a long journey for me to figure out. So when it comes to my own wellness practices and what I do, that was hard earned, I would say, but also not optional. It's not like I could, I'll meditate when I have time, or I'll do yoga when I have, it's not optional for me, it's required. So my own practices, I have a yoga practice every morning that I do at the beginning of the day with a meditation that allows me to check in and figure out, how am I doing today? And one of my questions, how much energy am I bringing to my day today? And then I do a midday meditation, which is really key for me because one of the things that you can get with fatigue sometimes is a bit of brain fog and brain pressure. And the meditation, it's amazing. I can meditate for 5 minutes and it clears that away. It resets me for the rest of my day. And then I learned there are things like, I know there's 3 things that I need to restore my energy. I need nature, I need exercise, and I need art. So I build in those things every weekend, and I also build in rest time. And for me, the best way to rest is to read. So I'm an avid reader of fiction novels, but I do it because it forces me to sit down or lie down and be quiet and rest. And that is what has worked for me. And so knowing that, that's been my own personal wellness journey, which is why wellness is so important to me.
Wow. Well, and thank you. And I've got so many comments coming in, and really appreciate the personal story and what you've learned through that journey, and tremendously inspiring. And once again, so much to take out of that. And for me, as you say, we sometimes can get caught in the trap of that we have endless energy, and it's very important back to that idea of intentionality. There's so much that I have. Where am I going to invest that energy? And what are the things that drain that energy from me, and be more intentional around that? I think that's so important. And considering how, I mean, mental health in organizations, you just see so much data coming out, which is not going in the right direction. You see so many comments in so many different layers in an organization where mental health is just a top priority, a top challenge. How do you, as CEO of the CMPA, bring that conversation forward into the organization, ensure people prioritize it, the practices that are there? How do you build a resilient organization?
Yeah, I mean, I won't pretend, Craig, that I've got all the answers because I think this is a really complex issue. But I will say this, you know, at the CMPA, our commitment to wellness, it really does come from the top. So for example, when I do my annual performance review with my board, they ask me, how are you doing with your own wellness? They
Mm,
want to know that I have continued to prioritize my wellness and that I am really investing in my own wellness. So the board cares about it, one. Second, I have worked really hard in my communications with the organization to talk about why wellness and well-being of our employees is important to us. So CMPA, like, our employees are the heart of the organization, right? We're a member-based organization. We cannot deliver any of our amazing member services without well employees. And I firmly believe that. I say it a lot, but I really think that our employees are prioritized, and they are prioritized in our strategic plan because we need them to be as well as possible to deliver member service.
mm,
I also really try to walk the walk. And by that, I mean, so there's talking about it. I talk a lot about, in terms of mental health, destigmatizing mental health. We talk a lot about, I will often say my messaging, it's okay not to be okay. It's okay to reach out for help. And it can be hard to reach out for help, but it's important to reach out for help. That is one of the biggest barriers we have. People don't like to talk about it. Even in healthcare, as healthcare providers, people don't want to admit that they have their own challenges, right? So it's normalizing, it's destigmatizing in the communications. And in terms of walking the walk, I also try to model. So a
mm,
couple of things that I do is I will talk about, I gave the example of going for a walk around the block. I'll talk about that. If I go in a meeting, I say, I just had a beautiful walk around the block, and the birds are singing and the flowers are out, and it was amazing. It was beautiful. I hope you get outside today. That's a tiny little thing. But the number of people who said to me, you know what, I heard what you said, and I went out for a walk and I feel amazing. I'm like, yeah, isn't that incredible what it can do, right? So little things like that in terms of modeling, that's what wellness can look like, and the importance of, for example, getting outside. The second is the importance of disconnecting. So I learned from Mamta Gautam, who's a very prominent leader in physician wellness in Canada, the importance of my email signature. So in my email signature, it says, I do not expect a reply from you on evenings and weekends. And the
mm,
reason why that's important is that we set unwritten and unspoken expectations. So if I, as a CEO, send an email out to my team at 10:30 at night, they're like, oh my God, I should be answering this email from Lisa. It's 10:30 at night. Even though I might be like, I just got into the hotel and connected my laptop and a whole bunch of emails went out and I had no expectation that you were going to answer me. But so unless you talk about that, so that's in my emails, and I talk about it and I say, unless I say this is urgent, if it's urgent, I'm going to text you, right? So I expect you not to be checking your email in the evening and not to be checking it on the weekend. And if there's something urgent, we have a way of communicating around that. But otherwise, that's our priority, is to unplug and give ourselves the space and time to recover, because we do our best work when we have that opportunity to recover. And so that unplugging piece is really key. And again, it's about kind of giving permission and saying, it's okay not to be looking at your email all the time. And I actually don't want you looking at your email all the time. And the same thing with vacations is, I unplug on vacation. So I'll say to my team, I will not be checking my email. You know how to reach me. You can text me, you can call me, but I'm not checking my email. And I'll say the same to them. And for some of them, it was very hard for leaders to not check their email on vacation. They were like, what do you mean? And then I never forget, one of my leaders went on vacation. She came back. She goes, I took your advice and I unplugged and I didn't check my email for the first time in 30 years. And oh my God, it felt amazing. I'm like, right? But
Yeah.
the other powerful thing about that is you're showing your team you trust them, right? You guys got this. I'm on vacation. If it's really urgent or you're really stuck, you can call me, but I'm not checking my email. And that creating that, I think, really helps facilitate a lot of the wellness and well-being and relationship to mental health, because we are so plugged in all the time. It's hard for us to set boundaries between work and personal life. And so sometimes you really got to be intentional about setting those boundaries.
Well, and again, so many fantastic comments coming in. This is so great. Great tips. Thank you. Thank you. Love your insight. And Lisa, it's interesting. You were talking earlier about leveraging the talents within your team and building your teams. And I love the point that you just made, that when we step away on vacation, it puts them in a position to take on more responsibility, to stretch, and grow and develop and learn. What a wonderful experience for them on that way. And also appreciate your point around the importance of role modeling, because if we're not modeling that behavior, and I hear this all the time, oh, well, it's said, and I also love how you highlight the importance of the why, start explain why it's important and model that behavior, because people go, well, yeah, it's just they say it's important, yet I don't see anyone at the upper level doing it. And if I do it, is there going to be a consequence? So being intentional, being mindful around this. And it's funny, one last thing I'll share, because it just prompted a memory for me. I remember a client of mine who went away, they put an email folder of all the emails they got when they were away, and they came back and they looked at it and it was thousands. And they said, this, if anyone cares, they'll just follow. And they hit delete like the first time. And they said they got 7 calls out of whatever it was, 2,000. And again, the world will be okay. So I love that part of it. I've got an amazing question here, and it's one I wanted to explore with you as well. And Dennis said, I am so inspired by your authenticity and vulnerability. This has been one of the best conversations I've heard in a very long time. What has given you the courage to be so open and share so much of who you are? I think it's awesome. So I echo that, and I want to dig into that myself.
Thanks, Craig. I mean, I think I've had, times in my career where, and I'll say, I think there's a gender lens to this, that sometimes women who are leading feel that there's certain expectations of roles that they have to flex into and change their personality to fit what's expected in a role. And I've seen that, and I've experienced some of that. And again, I think I've just been so fortunate to work with amazing mentors and coaches throughout my life. And one of the early pieces of advice I got from one of my colleagues, Jason Frank, an amazing Emerge Doc and internationally known educator, was he said, okay, Lisa, who are your mentors? And I'm like, oh, I have this guy. And he's like, you need a panel. You need your own board. You need to build it. So I built out my mentors to meet various needs and coaches. And the advantage of that, again, to me, it comes back about having the opportunity to reflect, but also starting to develop yourself with intention. And I think too, it does require, I've had the experience of putting myself out there, being vulnerable, and man, it's back to the empathy piece and seeing people connect with that. And when you have that positive reinforcing experience, you're like, okay, there's something here. And I won't pretend that it's always easy, right? Like sometimes you might be sort of tempted to be like, I'm just going to put a wall up here, or I'm not feeling this. But I think particularly in situations, for example, as a leader, one thing that stands out to me is when you have to give some challenging feedback to somebody, right? That's something that a lot of leaders find very difficult. It is hard and want to back away from. I had experiences very early in my career when I was teaching residents, where I was working with a resident and I was like, oh man, like there's a whole bunch of things that we're gonna have to talk about. And at the end of the shift, and I'm really tired. But what I learned very quickly was me starting off the conversation and saying, I care about you being the best Emerge Doc that you can be. That's why I'm here. And I'm gonna share with you some information that might be hard to hear, but the reason I'm sharing it is because I want you to be better and I want to help. And so when you make those connections with people, and that's being vulnerable too, because you're putting yourself out there, and so I had some very, very powerful conversations with young physicians who were maybe struggling.
Mm.
And there were emotions in these conversations, right? But the best part is when you hear from them, say 6 months later, and they say, that conversation was really hard, but I want to thank you because it made a big difference and I'll never forget it. And you see them improve and you're like, wow, that was amazing. So for me, and I also had experiences where I'd have those conversations with residents and I'd get an evaluation after and say, Dr. Calder said these things to me and I didn't like it, right? So that happens.
Yeah.
But I think that the number of times that I was able to open myself up and share something with them and say, like, I remember when I started and I remember how hard this was. I have been where you are, and share a bit of my story. Then you've got them engaged. You've showed that you care and they want to work with you. And to me, there's nothing better than that. So that's to me what taught me the power of vulnerability is for me being able to make those connections with people and watch them improve and then be like, that was meaningful to me. So that for me is just fuel, right? And so that's what's helped me throughout my career.
It's amazing. Again, so many comments that are coming through on this. And what I love, Lisa, about what you're sharing, several things. Number one, it reminds me of your very powerful, almost grounding question that you asked her, what's my purpose? Like, why am I here? And in that conversation, the thing that I also really appreciate what you're sharing is that, and then you make that explicit, not just for yourself, for the other person. I care about you. This is where it's coming from. This may be, and so declaring these things, and I love the power, you talked about the power of vulnerability. What a beautiful example of that. And if we all think about feedback conversation, how wonderful would that be as a framework to have these discussions going, you know what, I care, and that's what I'm trying to, this is what I'm looking to be helpful. So thank you. This is great. Time has flown by. We only have about 10 minutes left. It's pretty remarkable. So another area that I know that you're passionate about is in terms of EDI and EDI strategy. And so I'd love to hear more, Lisa, about what you're doing, what the CMPA is doing in this area, and what you feel other organizations need to do to address this really important area.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. We launched our equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy at the CMPA 2 years ago, and this became really apparent to me quickly as something that we needed to do for a whole bunch of reasons. The first is when I started as CEO, I did listening learning with employees, and I heard that some people were not feeling included. They were not feeling a sense of belonging with the organization. And then likewise, when we looked at the experience of our members, I started hearing that as well. And so we worked with a consultant with CCDI to really help us figure out where are our strengths, where are our challenges. So we did a lot of work in terms of focus groups and surveying with our employees, listening and learning sessions with our employees and with our members to understand the work we had to do. And there was no doubt in my mind when we look at the mission of the CMPA, which is to protect the professional integrity of physicians and advance the safety of medical care, that issues related to equity, to diversity, and to inclusion were intricately linked with our mission. So when we look at what's happening in healthcare and what physicians need right now is we recognize the diversity amongst our membership, and we as an organization need to reflect that, and we need to create safe spaces where our members feel seen and heard and valued. But to do that work effectively, you have to look internally. So you can't just be like, oh, hey, this is about all our physicians and our members, but by the way, we're not actually going to look at ourselves. So we really focused inwardly and we really looked at, okay, how are we doing? Where do we need to work? And so we developed a strategy that had 5 petals. It's focused on our members, our employees, our governance first, and then we're really moving into learning and advocacy. And we set very specific, tangible goals for ourselves, and we set in some accountability mechanisms. So we belong to a larger group of organizations, the Canadian Medical Forum, And that group really helped spur us on because they have done surveys every year to say, what are you doing in EDI? How are you advancing in terms of anti-racism work, for example? So we have an accountability to report to them and say, here's how we're doing. But we also heard loud and clear from our members, this is important to us, and our employees, this is important to us. So in doing that strategy, we have really taken on a deep commitment. And again, it's throughout the organization. Our board is fully behind this and is really spurring us on to keep working on EDI. Our leadership team in our survey was 100% committed to this, which is huge. And it's a great place to start. And we have a lot of work to do, there is no doubt. But we're looking at making tangible differences. And we also spoke with stakeholders that represented certain groups, so we understood what was important to them. So we've started our EDI journey. It is a long-term journey. It is not a tick box exercise for us at all. We have taken it very seriously. We have just hired in the fall our new strategic lead for EDI, Dr. Sivan Bayukian. She's amazing with tons of expertise. We're building an EDI office, and we have a measurement framework to show that we're making progress against our goals. So it's exciting work. And I have to say, Craig, as much as it's daunting and challenging and it's hard to hear some of the experiences that our members and our employees have, that's not what you want to be happening. But the level of engagement we've had from our employees and our members who are like, I am so glad that you're doing this. This work is really important. It's energized people. People are like, let's do it. Let's get into it. And so that's been really exciting to see.
Well, and thank you for sharing that. And so again, several comments. Love the thoughtful approach to this. So important. Really appreciate how you're making it a priority and engaging people in that process. Again, it's fantastic. And I love how you framing it, Lisa, in terms of it's daunting work. There's a ways to go and important conversations to be had. And it's energizing because we're tackling things that matter. And I also love that collaborative approach to it, right? Where it's, well, we're all going to figure this out together. Only a few more. So any last questions you want to get in, because we're soon going to be out of time. This is fabulous. I've got another question from Steve saying, I've written down so many notes about how to be a great leader today. I'm just starting my journey. Any other advice or tips around, as I aspire to be a great leader, what I can do or things I should take on?
Well, first of all, Steve, I love that you're aspiring to be a great leader, because that's where it starts. Because I think that sometimes people end up in leadership positions and it's not necessarily what they want. And so when you're in a leadership position and you want to be great, that's such an amazing place to start. And we're in a situation now where there's so many resources out there. So there's Craig's podcast, there's a whole bunch of podcasts, there's amazing books, there's amazing courses. I did a fellowship in patient safety leadership with the American Hospital Association that was, I don't use this word lightly, transformative for me. It exposed me to such key fundamental concepts that I've used throughout my leadership career, concepts such as psychological safety, just culture, how to engage teams, how to use data to advance leadership. All of those really sort of core concepts for me were really helpful. And so I think that sometimes, depending on the organization or industry you're in, we can think that leaders are just, sort of born, or you just kind of fall into leadership positions. I don't think that's the reality anymore. And I think the great leaders are the ones who really think about, what does it take to be a great leader? What do I need to do? How do I continually evolve as a leader? So I'm still learning about leadership. I don't pretend to be an expert in leadership at all. I continue to learn about leadership. I continue to seek out articles on leadership. I continue to reflect on leadership. What's working? What do I need to do better? And the last thing I'll say, Stephen, one of the best things you can do is seek feedback. So one thing that people hear from me all the time is I'll say, I want to hear your feedback on this. Even if it's, and anytime anyone gives me a kudos and says, Lisa, that was amazing, I say, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I also want to hear from you. If I do something that you're like, I wasn't so sure about that one, I want to hear it. And the interesting thing about that, in my position as a CEO, I've heard from other CEOs, is they talk about this phenomenon where feedback dries up. That is the worst place to be in.
Sure.
Because you cannot get better without feedback. So I am constantly seeking out the feedback and trying to create mechanisms where, like, because sometimes people don't want to say to my face, here's your feedback. So like, hence perfect example is the employee engagement survey, which was anonymous. And we put a question in there, what's your message for the CEO, right? So we have multiple mechanisms in the CMPA for employees to provide feedback. So even if they don't want to tell me to my face, they can send an anonymous Ask Lisa question or put in a suggestion. So ask for the feedback, because that is the key to being a great leader. And don't be afraid to listen to the feedback, even if it might be something that you're like, your first reaction is like, I don't do that, or like, I don't believe that, or I really don't want to hear that. Sometimes you just need to sit with it. So that's the other thing, is if you get a piece of feedback that you're like, I'm not crazy about that, write it down, sit with it, come back to it 48, 72 hours later, talk about it with someone else, a coach, a mentor, and say, I got this feedback and I actually don't know what to think about it, or I really don't like it. Process it, look for what you can learn from it, because inevitably there's something there that you can learn from.
Well, and Steve said in all caps, thank you for that answer. And to add to that, I think, Lisa, what's really great is how you highlighted Steve's desire to be a leader, because in a lot of cases it's just people fall into it. And I think that aspiration around, well, I want to be the best that I can be. And it reminds me of a great, the quote of feedback being the breakfast of champions, so to speak, and to how to get as much as you possibly can. So we've got a couple of minutes left. This has just been awesome. Your energy, I've had so many comments on your energy, your authenticity, the insights that you've provided. Is there anything that we haven't touched on, or a key idea you want to circle back to as we close our conversation today?
I think maybe we can tie some of the themes together, Craig, because I think that we've been talking about authenticity, we've been talking about wellness, we've been talking about leadership and EDI. For me, all of these things actually really come together. And I think when we look at the future of leadership, and what we need to think about is we need to cultivate leaders who really ask themselves, what is authenticity? What does it look like? How do I become an empathetic leader? How do I really think about why taking care of myself is going to help me be a better leader for others, and why that truly needs to become first priority. And I will just say, this is challenging for female leaders in particular. So the more that we can model this, and what excites me is when I hear other women say, you know what, Lisa, when I see how you prioritize your wellness and you're a mother to 2 teenage girls and you're a CEO, I think to myself, I could do that too. Win. Like, I love that, right? And so to me, as we're looking to enhance diversity in leadership and inclusion in leadership and offering people more opportunities, it is really talking about it openly, about why these things are important, encouraging it others. And when you see it in others, give them the opportunities, help them move up and move along, bring people with you. That to me is, I think, the really exciting opportunity before us to have intentional, authentic, empathetic, and highly effective leaders.
Well, thank you. And I couldn't agree more. And what I love similarly is that how these things go together so incredibly well. And back to that, you noted it earlier, Lisa, about the power of reflection, taking that time, asking ourselves questions, getting outside of the do, just keep on the activity, and really being intentional about where we spend our time, how we spend our time, with whom, all of those things. And through that process, we can create amazing things together by working together. So thank you so much. So as I close, just before final thoughts, I wanted to let people know that on Monday, May 20th at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, our next guest for the live podcast will be Nick Bloom, who's a global thought leader in remote work, has done countless studies around the effectiveness and effects of working from home and remote work, a Stanford professor, and he's joining us at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. If you're interested in joining and you haven't seen the post on LinkedIn, reach out to me. And finally, Lisa, thank you so much. Just your passion, your energy, your insights, your willingness to share and be who you are, and share all of the great things that you've done is really wonderful and fits so beautifully into the Do Good to Lead Well framework. So my profound thanks before we say goodbye today.
Thanks very much, Craig. I really enjoyed this, and thanks for everyone's questions. It was a lot of fun.
All right, everybody, take care. Look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.